So that night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford at Jabbok. And after he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions, and so Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I won't let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" And Jacob answered, "Jacob." And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." And then verse 29, Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. Father, for all that this story meant and still means, help us to apply it and absorb it into our lives as well. In Jesus' name, amen. Go ahead, have a seat. I don't know what kind of relationship you and God might have at the moment, but I'll bet you've never wrestled with him before. This is, and I don't mean in like the figurative sense either. We'll get to the figurative here soon enough. But one of the reasons this passage is so famous is not just because Jacob is a significant patriarch in the lineage of Jesus, or not just because Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, who received the covenant promise that through his family God was going to save the world, but one of the reasons this passage is so famous is based on just how raw and shocking that it is. Jacob's conclusion after all of this experience was that somehow he saw the face of God. That this was a very mysterious sort of man-like figure, that somehow this embodied man that we see in this passage, it's almost intentionally very vague and mysterious, as if this is God himself wrestling with Jacob. Now, just placing aside exactly how all of that works for a moment, the idea of it's profound. And we see the idea of it actually come from the renaming that Jacob gets to Israel, or Yisrael, which means struggler with God or wrestler with God. So literally the name of God's people that he initiates here with Jacob and then becomes the name of a whole people group, a whole nation, means those who wrestle with God. And the idea of it, many scholars will go back and forth on a little bit. In fact, some of you may have heard this passage preached once or twice, and maybe some of you have heard it preached in particular tones or directions, because some people will take it as a positive. Look at Jacob, cares about God, invested into God, and is going to deal with God in a nitty-gritty, like he's going to go after God, he's going to seek God, he's going to literally wrestle with God. However, if you look at the broader story of Jacob's life, this story is really about his larger life story. This isn't just about one isolated moment, but this is about a pattern of existence that he has had in the world. This is about a way in which he has oriented himself, not just towards God, but everyone else. And from day one of Jacob's life, it has been a life of struggle. It has been a life of wrestling. Jacob literally means deceiver or grasper, and it came from the moment of his birth. His mom gave birth to him and his fraternal twin. He was the second to come out. And from the birth story, we get this interesting little detail that somehow Jacob was grasping at his brother's heel. The idea being that the firstborn was supposed to be privileged with the birthright and a blessing, that they were supposed to receive a double portion of inheritance, that in the ancient world, especially the way inheritance worked, this was very important, because essentially if you have a lot of kids and you divided up all your inheritance equally among them, that you would get down to a postage stamp really quickly, and the land wouldn't be very useful anymore. And so this was a measure in order to keep the land within the family and steward it properly within the family. And so the firstborn would receive that. The firstborn would receive a double portion. The firstborn would receive the birthright and the blessing of the family to carry on both the name and the reputation of the family. And even more so, in Jacob's family, this meant, because of the promise made to his grandpa, that he, whoever this firstborn or the one receiving birthright and blessing child would be the carrier of the lineage of the Savior. Abraham received this promise many years prior, that out of his line would come one who would restore salvation and blessing to the whole world. And we've been looking at every generation of his family, knowing that only one will be chosen out of all of that generation to carry that line. And Jacob comes out of the womb almost as if set and determined to be that guy, even though he doesn't fit the natural birth order. And so from the very beginning of his life, he's struggling, he's striving, he's wrestling. He wants to be something, he wants to achieve something, he wants to have something that is not seeming like it's coming to him naturally. It's almost as if his life is an uphill battle in his mind. And he's always having to fight for, work for every scrap of blessing that he ever has. Now, I don't know how many of you can identify with this, but the idea that everything you have in life, you have to fight for. I'm sure you can find some good Instagram reels of some motivational speakers out there that'll convince you that is a life model that you're supposed to adopt. And some of you know what this can look like because you yourself are that person, or you're related to this person, or you're friends with this person. That the mindset is essentially, life is war, and all that I get out of it is that which I fight for. Well, this was Jacob's mentality. Now, I'm going to show my age a little bit, but any of y'all remember the movie Trading Places from way back in the day? This was a classic. Thank you, my fellow Gen Xer, for that show of solidarity. Trading Places, a classic film. Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy are starring in this movie, and it's the premise of the whole movie is that Dan Aykroyd is this wealthy Wall Street guy, and Eddie Murphy is this homeless guy, and that there's these people that are going to engineer somehow. They make a random bet to engineer that if we just give them all the circumstance one another has, I'll bet this homeless guy could do just as well as this Wall Street, Harvard-educated guy, so on and so forth. And so they essentially take away everything from Dan Aykroyd and kick him out on the streets, and then they bring this guy from the streets, and then they bring him into the mansions, into all the power, into all the networks, into all the money. And one of the pivotal scenes, more funnier scenes of the movie, is when Eddie Murphy, this homeless man off the street, comes to the mansion to be introduced to what is now his. He's walking through the mansion, stealing everything he can find. He's taking the silverware, he's taking the jewelry, he's taking all the art pieces, anything he can cram in his pockets, and he has to be reminded over and over again, no, this is yours now. We're giving this to you. And he's like, oh yeah, that's great. You can imagine Eddie Murphy in his voice. I won't attempt to do it. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. Just think the donkey from Shrek. That's how empty your generation is that I have to reference Eddie Murphy at that level. But the idea is simply, it's already yours, and you think you have to steal it. Back when I was teaching in an elementary classroom, I will never remember this one kid. Every day after school, it was my assignment when I was student teaching at the time to go into this kid's desk and to clear it out. Because this kid would go throughout the day, the entire classroom, and steal everything in the classroom and put it in his desk. And at the beginning, it's frustrating. It's like, look, you can't hoard all the rulers and the tape and the pencils and the crayons and the markers. They're for everybody to share. But the idea was, every single day, you would find a rat's nest of all of the materials in class somehow stowed, because the child's background came from a home where nothing was given to him. And in order to even have his basic level needs of survival met, he learned to cheat, lie, and steal. This is Jacob. This is Jacob. And no matter how many times you would sit down with the child and say, look, you are not in trouble. I just need you to know that if you just trust for a moment that all of this grand blessing of school materials is for you, you can use it anytime you want. It's available to you. You don't have to take it. You don't have to hide it. You don't have to steal it. You don't have to lie for it. It's here for you. You're like Eddie Murphy trying to steal the silverware, but I'm telling you, it's yours. It's for you. But when people, especially human beings, when we're born into this broken world and experience the void or lack of our deepest core needs going unmet, man, do we figure out solutions to meet them on our own terms. You do this in your own way. I do this in my own way. Maybe you got an Instagram filter that helps you to achieve it. Maybe you've actually learned how to lie, cheat, and steal to achieve it. Maybe some of you have figured out how to be the nice guy or the nice girl or the rule follower or the people pleaser, doing everything you can to essentially win the favor of everyone you can, so that you'll never have to lay at night worrying about whether or not you are going to receive that which you feel like you most deeply need. That essentially you felt like you have strived for, wrestled for, fought for the right to have that which you most want. This is Jacob's life. It started at birth. It started literally in the womb. Literally in the womb, he and his brother were wrestling. And then as it went on later in life, Jacob sold his brother a bowl of stew for his birthright, and then later deceived his father by dressing up like his brother to steal his blessing. Everything that Jacob has ever done has been about looking out for him, but the crazy part of the story was that prior to his birth, God had spoken. God had spoken to his mom. God had spoken to his family and said that it's Jacob that will receive the blessing. The older will serve the younger. But rather than trusting this or simply receiving this, rather than living as if that was true, Jacob made sure that it was true and made sure that it was true on his own terms, all the way to the point of lying to his elderly father, who was growing blind, putting on animal fur to imitate the hairiness of his brother. He literally acts from day one of the story all the way almost to the very end of his life as if he himself is the devil and the serpent of Genesis chapter 3. This is his life. And so you think to yourself, okay, this is the chosen one. This is the line that God's going to work through. And you look at Jacob's life, and there's not a whole lot of redemptive stories to find. And by not a whole lot, I would say none. None. Both his dad and his grandpa have selective moments where things go okay. But if you want to summarize the totality of your life, you're giving them a big 2 thumbs down. But Jacob is a whole nother story. And when it comes to this moment in Genesis 32, this is the real turning point and defining moment. After all the incredible stories he's gone through, and after all the stories that we could have walked through exclusively here this morning, it's Genesis 32 that really sets the table, not just to understand him, but I think to understand us. And Jacob is about to come back to the land after 20 years of alienation. He's now built himself up a family. He now has a level of wealth. And he's about to head back into land to encounter his older brother. The older brother that you know, he deceived, lied to, and stole the birthright and blessing from. Convinced that his brother wants to kill him, he's a little worried. He rallies up a strategy that divide up all of his possessions into 2 different camps so that if one gets raided and attacked, he's still got another. He sends everyone out ahead of him and stays back alone and behind, like an introvert's dream. And he's sitting here alone on the other side of the river, having now a profound experience with God, but it's sitting in this deep place of angst and anxiety. Not the least of which, because he's heard the report that his brother Esau is going to come out to meet him, but he's bringing with him 400 warriors. So that doesn't sound like a welcome crew, you know what I mean? Doesn't sound like a hospitality team. That sounds like a fight ready to happen. Esau is not much of a fighter. He was a mama's boy. Artistic type, indoor kid, not an outdoor kid. His brother was the outdoor type. He probably had a compound bow somewhere in the back of his pickup truck, I'm just assuming. He probably had a decent amount of his wardrobe that was mossy oak material. I'm just guessing. And so Jacob is already seeing the writing on the wall. Me versus him is not going to go well. Art is fine and good in the gallery, but on the battlefield, not so much. You know what I mean? Sorry, am I insulting all you artists out there? We love you, but there are certain situations in which your skill set no longer applies. You know what I mean? And that's Jacob. And so in this moment where his life feels like it's about to end, where he's terrified that the ball's going to drop and every consequence that he's ever deserved is going to flood back onto him, what does he do? He ends up wrestling with God himself. Wrestling with God himself, demanding him to bless him. Demanding that God would bless him. Listen to that language. Demanding that God would bless him. Now, if he would have listened to his grandpa tell stories, or even his father tell stories, he would have heard something about God during that time. That God's disposition is actually quite generous. In fact, the promise made to his grandpa was that God would bless him, but there was no contingencies on that. There's no, if you do this, then you'll be blessed. God said to his grandfather, look, I'm just going to bless you. That's just the way it's going to be. You're a no name from the land of Babylon in the midst of all these like pagan, like idolatrous worshipers, but I'm picking you as my own, no clue as to why, exclusively in the prerogative of God, as if he's just willing to pick an average Joe to achieve his grand purposes in the world. And if he would have listened well, he would have realized God is not one that you fight for blessings for. He's one that actually freely wants to give. He asks you to freely receive. That's what the essence of faith is. I don't know, like we get all these images in our head of what we think biblical, scriptural, or sort of Christian faith looks like. But if you just were to boil it down, it's just a relational trust that God will be generous to me and all of my needs as a human because that's who he is. I don't have to fight for it. I don't have to work for it. He's gracious. He's compassionate. He's generous. There's no lack on the inside of him. It's not like he's obtuse to all the needs that I have. That's what God is like. Humans have a tendency to live in a wild distrust and unbelief, believing that somehow if we work for it, somehow if we strive for it, wrestle for it, fight for it, lie for it, cheat for it, I can get the blessing on my own terms and bypass ever having to actually trust the character of the God whose blessing I desire. And it's as if Jacob is like that little baby of mistrust grown into like a full-grown adult. And as he's wrestling with God, there's a few things that I think we need to take notice of before we close up, and then I'll invite the worship team back. As he's wrestling with God, you'll notice that God comments like, this kid ain't quitting. In fact, it says that daybreak came, which in our minds, we think of like the morning as the beginning of the day. But in the Hebrew, it would be the evening. This is dusk. So it's like this kid, like he might go all night. He's not stopping. He is so stubborn. Parents, don't raise your hand, but you have a child like this in your home. They won't quit. Like they will ask you 100 times, no matter how many times you give them, they just won't stop. This is God. He can resonate with you. He gets it. He gets us. He won't quit. And you think to yourself, okay, Jacob against, God. Is this a fair fight? But the first thing you observe is that though God could exert overwhelming force to break him, he doesn't. God actually comes in weakness to meet Jacob in his arrogance. And this is only going to foreshadow that very heart and character of God is going to get embodied in Jesus, that when he comes to save us from sin and death, he doesn't do it by bringing out a sword, drawing a line right through the middle of humanity, calling one side the good guys and the other the bad guys, but literally lays down his life. He doesn't strive for religious or political power. He simply gives it all away to the point of being crucified for us. And out of the weakness of God comes the salvation of the world. This isn't something that Jesus invented. This is the consistent character of God from day one. Let me tell you this, God can break you. Sometimes it's easy to think that your stubbornness is winning. But just like Jacob, you can be deceived into thinking that somehow your perseverance, your stubbornness, your willingness to fight and endure for that which you feel like is entitled to you, somehow that's overcoming God's will. God just happens to be very merciful and gracious. One of the things you learn when you parenting kids is that all your kids are a little different. And if I look at my daughter with even the slightest of glances in a negative direction, she's done. There are other children in my home for whom a glance will do nothing, for whom the threat of nuclear war will do very little. And there's been moments and times when you even think back, and my wife and I have reflected on the children we've raised in our home and the level of endurance. And you wonder to yourself, are we raising Al-Qaeda? Who could endure like waterboarding, like no problem. But when you learn the different temperaments of each of your kids, the goal as a parent isn't to break them. It's to connect with them. It isn't just to dominate them with your authority. It's to help them learn how to trust your authority. Because you are the most visible, tangible representation they have in their life of God. And that is the ultimate goal. Because one day, my kids are I got an 18-year-old now, so, good night and good luck. So they're making their own decisions. I don't bear the same authority. One day, maybe some have your kids. They get married, have their own families. That's not your family expanding. They're starting their own families. You don't want them to learn how to follow every word you say. You want them to learn how to trust authority, particularly God's authority, because that is the authority that will remain with them for their whole lives. How is it that God interacts with us? He doesn't just break us to make us the slaves doing his bidding. But in his gracious kindness, he knows the wise ways in order to woo us closer to his heart. Even if it means getting into a wrestling match with us. But he will not overpower you. That's not what this God is like. What he does do is wound him. He dislocates his hip socket. And the word that the Genesis writers use there is the word he touched. He touched it. And this is exactly what you think it is. It's like, boop, like let go in the other direction, like your G.I. Joe soldiers used to play with, you know what I mean? And just switch it up. Like that kind of stuff. So you think like this was never some equal wrestling match all along. And it's only until I had a hip pointer once in high school. That is the worst pain I've ever felt. I've watched my wife endure 4 childbirths, and I'm pretty sure that's worse. But I'm still going to say this was pretty bad. Pretty sure I'm positive. I'm positive it was worse, honey. I'm positive. It hurts super bad. It's only until Jacob's alerted to his pain that he actually relents and trusts. And trusts, sort of. And so there's a couple things here. Number one, everyone needs to wake up to whatever fight you think you're struggling with in life is ultimately against God, not whatever you think it is. If you're fighting against the man or you're fighting against the church, that's one of my favorite things, by the way. Come talk to a pastor about your problems with the church. Oh, really? The church. You know, the 2 billion folks that identify with Jesus in almost every continent, language around the world. The church. Tell me about the church. Well, you know, the church is always like this. Oh, really? The church, billions of people across continents, is universally and unequivocally like this one thing. Can you just give me the name of the person that said the thing or did the thing? Can we just talk about them for a second instead of the church? You think it's like the government, or it's the church, or it's like it's all men, or it's all women, or it's all these people, it's all the woke progressives, or it's just all the conservative MAGAs. Like we all have in our head who our struggle and striving is against. For some of you, it was against your parents. For some of you, it was against siblings. Some of you, it was almost like, no, it was against me. Like I was my own worst enemy, and I was beating myself up to be my best every single day. And like you are the incessant like language of Jacob-level struggle. But what Jacob has to wake up to, and I believe what the story is meant to wake up to, is that your real struggle is always with God. That unless you deal with him, everything else is superficial. That unless you come to terms with everything you've been fighting for in your life, it's been ultimately a fight against him. Not realizing that you are living out of a mistrust, conniving and operating on your own terms and in your own ways to achieve your own ends, and that the one you're really wrestling with is not the world around you. It's him. And just like Jacob, you need to come to terms that God is not who you've assumed he is. That your mistrust in him is misplaced simply because you fail to recognize how gracious and compassionate he is, how generous he is. That when he speaks promises of blessing to you, It doesn't come with this contingency on his part. That he loves you as a kid. And this level of trust is what God's trying to develop in us. And once you come to terms there, I can tell you in many, many years of life experience, to everyone that comes to this little Genesis 32 wrestling moment in their life and recognizes the real one that they're wrestling with, they win. Stuff tends to go much better for them as they learn to allow their hearts to be overcome with his love and to simply learn how to trust and submit themselves to his generous and kind care. That's winning. But secondly, God almost always has to wound you to get you there. Not always, but we're batting 99%. And we could go around the room, we could have ourselves a little time, and we could go into the wee morning hours, you know what I mean? Just yeah, tell me your wound. What was your hip socket? What was your thing? And we could go through it. And you would tell me about health problems. You would tell me about financial ruin. You'd tell me about family drama and issues. You'd tell me about deep pains and betrayals. You would tell me about hitting rock bottom. You'd tell me about the drugs. You'd tell me about the lust. You'd tell me about the addictions. You would tell me about all the things in your life that has just wounded you and got you to the place of recognizing maybe I can't do this on my own way. And pretty much anyone in this area, I was going to say room, not so much, anyone in this place that is a genuine follower of Jesus has a story like that. Some of your hip wounds are a little bit more extreme and exaggerated than others, but we're all walking with a limp if you know Jesus. He had to wound you in order to teach you how to trust him and walk with him, because you're so insistent on doing it your own way. And once we come to terms with Jacob, we realize this amazing story leading us to an amazing God, inviting us to a God who won't break you, but he wants to love you. And there's part of us that resists that because we believe the lie that that's not what God's like. But when we look at the cross, that's all that we see. What else do you see except a God that is bleeding, being murdered by his own creation in order to be reconciled to that creation? What else do you see but a God of just incredible love, mercy, grace, and sacrifice? What else do you see? What else do you see? This is why Christians, I don't know why you wear your cross necklace or your cross earrings. I don't know why, you have cross hangings up in your house. This is why Christians think about this ancient torture device used to humiliate and murder people in excruciating fashion. This is not the thing that, pretty girls should be wearing around their neck as a fashion item. You know what I mean? But why do we do it? Because it reminds us of the radical love of God. And that every time we wrestle with him, it's wasting our energy. It's fighting the wrong battle. That God's desire is for us, and your sin is against him. And if you can wake up to that, the sooner, the better. Because walking with God is not meant to be a wrestling match. And even if in the severe mercy of God, he has to give you a limp, I'll be the first in line to say, thank God for the limp that taught me to trust. The first Christian author that I read when I became a Christian in my 20s was Larry Crabb, Finding God. He's still one of my favorite authors to this day. I grieved because he passed away just a year, maybe 2 years ago. But there's a short little story that Larry tells in this passage that shook me even as an early Christian. And he talked about a friend who had cancer that went into remission. But you know what his prayer was? He said, Father, bring the cancer back if it brings me closer to you. Whatever it takes for me to trust you more, to be closer to you, to see your face, that's what I want. Use whatever limp you need to get me closer to you. And I just don't know how I felt about that. Well, once you realize there's nothing greater than him, nothing higher than him, there's nothing that you were made for other than him, and that our foolish, stubborn wanderings and wrestlings that tend to find our own way, whatever it takes to help me realize, even with severe mercy, the generosity and abundant love of my God, that I might be with him and near to him and trust him and love him and walk with him, not just now, but into eternity. Father, let your kingdom come and your will be done. In my life, Father, whatever socket of my hip has to be touched by you so that I don't resist you or wrestle with you. May it be done. And that, my friends, if that is an unimaginable perspective to you, then my friends, you yourself are having your own little Jacob moment right now. This isn't just his story. This is our story. This isn't just a story about something that happened. This is a story about what always happens. This is about what happens continually and constantly. And I don't care if you're 20, 40, 80, 100. We're all working out how to trust in the character of God and simply keep in step with him. And those of us that have learned the pains of our limps and the lessons from them realize it is the kindness of God that is keeping me closer to him. He won't break me, but he might wound me. And if I can see past my stubborn resentment to the wound, I might see what the wound is intended to do. I don't know that Jacob got that lesson. I'm pretty sure that he didn't, because he was a way more jacked up dad than his dad and his grandpa ever were. But Jacob is not the one that we look to, it's Jesus. And Jesus was so faithful with his father, he did not have to be wounded to walk with him. And yet, he was for us.